with generative AI, it can give you a different insight. Now, ultimately, you're the one that needs to decide if that insight is valuable or not, and how to take that insight and make it something that is of value to you.
Welcome to Get Unstuck and On Target, the weekly podcast that offers senior leaders insights and strategies to not only lead with confidence and vision, but also to achieve groundbreaking results. I'm your host, Mike O'Neill. I coach top-level executives on the power of ethical leadership to forge teams to be as united as they are effective. In each episode, join me for insightful conversations with leaders just like you, providing practical advice to help you get unstuck and propel you and your company forward. Let's get started. Joining me is Dr. Robert Joseph. He is the co-founder and president of MindShift, a technology and talent development company on a mission to empower and increase the proficiency of talent in digital, data, technology, and job readiness. With a BS and MS in electrical engineering from MIT and an MS and PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon, he has deep technical roots. He's built hundreds of mobile, web, and desktop apps. He even has a patent for an internet DJ system. However, his proudest accomplishment is to be the father of two young adult men. I've invited Dr. Joseph on because he could speak on a wide variety of topics, but the thing that we spent most of our time talking about is AI. What is it? And why should leaders really understand it? And in what ways, once they understand it, can they drive value out of AI? Welcome, Robert.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so excited to be here, Mike.
You know, I don't typically read the bio credentials, but I have to admit, those are impressive academic credentials. And I know that you use those credentials because I didn't mention this, but you also teach at the collegiate level. Matter of fact, I'm not sure I know what you don't do well.
Oh, thank you. You know, one of the things that I like doing is following my passion and figuring out how to follow my passion with what I'm trying to do is something that drives me, and I love teaching. And so I got involved actually on the advisory board at Georgia State University for computer science department. And in that capacity, a slide opened up for an instructor to come and teach web programming. And I was like, oh, this is fantastic. I'll do that. And it's really interesting how synergies work together, because when I started doing the web programming class, it was during the pandemic. And so we were virtual. And that's when I started using the flipped classroom that we are using to this day for our own company. And so we got 3 years of doing online classes where that's where the education is. And then using Zoom meetings to bring in guest speakers to come and tell the students about what is it like to be in a web development arena or a web development company. What do recruiters look for when they're recruiting people? So we like to do our training so that it's a full 360-degree understanding of what it takes to use the skill, not just to acquire the skill.
I have a number of professor friends, so I hope they don't take offense. But what I would say, when I have a conversation with them in a social setting, I know that at times my eyes tend to glass over. However, that's where you and I met. We met in a social setting. We struck up a conversation. The more we talked, the more I enjoyed talking with you. And I said, goodness gracious, you'd be a great podcast guest. And here we are. You're on the podcast. Can we go back to academia for a moment? One thing I thought that when I was speaking to you, I said, Dr. Joseph is not a typical person. He's able to explain things, even though he has advanced training, that I can even understand. How have you used that gift in your role as co-founder of MindShift.
First off, can I just get you as a hype man to just follow me around? Thank you very much. You're very kind. One of the things that I find is that people focus on how do I do something, and they get into the weeds, and they don't focus on why am I doing it or how does it work in general. And so what actually we developed is a course called Enhanced Learning, in which we take people through the process of emotion and self-talk, learning to learn how to learn, and then sort of how to generalize that. And a lot of things that people find complicated, if you abstract it up, conceptually, it's pretty simple. And then once people understand the concept, then filling in how to do it is a lot easier because they have something to put their hat on. They have something to say, oh, okay, I see why these steps need to be done because this is the higher thing that I'm trying to accomplish. And, that's been developed since I was a kid. My mom was a teacher, and she would explain things to me several different ways. And when I asked her a question or wanted something, she would say, okay, how do you say that in different ways? So she actually groomed me to think about how to explain things so that people can understand it. And my parents were awesome.
When you said you have a gift to explain things, and I introduced AI into the mix, I did so in large part because we see it everywhere. But what I was particularly interested in is for us to have a conversation about our listeners. They are leaders. Leaders want to embrace the latest, quote, technology. And sometimes embracing that technology might not in of itself be in the best interest of the business. It may not necessarily drive value. Give us a sense of kind of what you mean by that, please.
Sure. And let me give you a little bit of background where I'm coming from, because we've talked about the academic experience that I have. I also have been in industry, so I understand some of the pressures that leaders have, as well as some of the, jumping on the latest hype because you're hearing all these savings that the hype can, or not the hype, all these savings that the technology can lend you. Before Team MindShift, I was a director and a senior data scientist, and then a director at Stanley Black & Decker doing Industry 4.0 work in manufacturing. And I also did some supply chain. So I actually got to live and breathe this. And I saw many projects that failed, not because of the technology, but because of the use of the technology not being tied to driving value. What I mean by that is, for example, I saw the company have the data scientists go down to the plant and say, oh, what I want you to do is we have the defects that are happening, and I want you to tell me when the machine is having these defects. And the data scientist says, great, we can do that. And so the data scientist would take all the data and say, oh, when the machine is in this configuration, then defects are being made. And so the people at the manufacturing place said, that's great. Now, I need to get that down to the floor where the person is working the machine. And the data scientists say, okay, well, you guys do that. We solved the problem that you asked. And if they had redone the problem or rephrased the problem and say, I want to let this machine operator know when a part is defected so that they can take corrective actions, then they would have looked at how to deliver it to the machine operator in a way that allowed that machine operator to take action, not just solve the problem of finding the defect. And that's just one example of many projects that weren't value driven, but they were let's use the latest technology because everybody's saying that it will do X, Y, and Z.
Our listeners come from many different industries, so my question will be a little bit generic. But when you mention manufacturing, that is a background I'm very familiar with. Let's go back to the AI for a moment. It's caught the attention of everybody, and leaders in particular need to feel like they're leading in that respects. How would you advise leaders to look at AI?
Yeah. So to pop this up a little bit in terms of a generic understanding, I would say not figure out, what values you're trying to drive. You've got a whole list of things that either your boss or your stockholders or things like that, or you've said, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. And then in the context of that, see where AI fits in. And when we talk about AI nowadays, we're really talking about generative AI a lot of times. And generative AI is only one small segment of AI. And AI is only one small segment of all the technology out there that you have to take advantage of. And so when you start to talk about driving value, then, for instance, I use as a simple example from marketing. I can use generative AI to create articles that are brilliant, that people will read all the time, and I can post them on LinkedIn. I can get a lot of readership from them. And that will allow me to create articles that people like. But if my goal is to create articles to drive people to buy or to drive people to make a subscription, then that focus changes how I do the articles, because I do want people to be engaged in the articles, but I want those articles to also lead to an action. And when I make that shift to say, I want to drive value by having this action take place, then I can say, okay, now generative AI, create an article for me with these parameters that help drive people to do this action. And that simple transformation of how to think about it is something that can transform your success rate for using AI. And so with that, just to continue your question, the way to think about it is to think about, okay, what value am I trying to drive? And then what can generative AI do? And then can that thing that generative AI do drive that value? And you've seen generative AI produce new articles, new writing, new emails, and things like that. You've also can see generative AI being used as a thought partner, where you're saying, what about, I'm trying to do this. Give me some ideas of the domain space that I'm in, and what are some ways in which I can either solve this problem or think about this. And for me, I've used that time and time again, and it's come up with things that, I thought about that. But it's also come up with things like, I didn't think about that. That's really good. So let me pause here.
Well, I followed you very clearly, and let me see if I can say it back to you. And
Sure.
That is, the first example you gave is one that solopreneurs can kind of identify with, because what they're trying to do is be seen out there. They're competing against much bigger people. And therefore, there's a tendency to say, I want to write something that people are going to like. Yes. And it becomes a little bit of a vanity thing. How many likes and comments can I get? And on one hand, you would say, well, that accomplishes something. But what you've challenged us to be thinking is, but what do you really want to accomplish? Yeah. You want to drive behavior that results in business. What do you have to do to generate that? Do you want them to subscribe to a newsletter? Do you want them to reach out and schedule a phone call? But if you start with what you're developing and put out there with that in mind, then I think what I understand you to be saying is that you're kind of baking in that value up front.
Yes.
Okay.
Very good.
I want to ask you to go a little bit deeper. And
Sure.
that is, we've got listeners who are managing SaaS organizations. They are managing more sophisticated type organizations that are changing dramatically. How do you advise those who are in key leadership roles, who are surrounded by a lot of smart people who are familiar with all of the latest technology? How do you advise leaders to not get so Google-eyed, if I could use that term, over all the possibilities, particularly from AI?
It's interesting because I would advise them to keep their people grounded. So to really, when people bring something and saying, and I'm an engineer, data scientist, technologist. And so I really like technology. And it's so funny, I'll bring to my business partner, I say, look, this is something we can do. And he'll say to me, okay, what value does that bring? And if you start the question, then people bring things to you about technology with, okay, how are you going to use this to drive value? It starts them transitioning into thinking, okay, I'm developing this, but I need to think further than this is the neatest thing since sliced bread, but I need to think further in what will this do for my company? And so that's one. The other is be very clear on the values that you want your people to bring. And I mean, this is kind of leadership 101. But sometimes people get lost in that, okay, I'm reading Gardner reports, I'm reading New York Times, I'm reading the Wall Street Journal, and they're saying generative AI can save my company 30% of work, or it can do X, Y, and Z. And it can do those things, but it's not the use of the technology that does that. It's the use of the technology to help with the things that you need to do already. So how do you drive value? Like if you can do this thing that drives value 30% faster, then do this thing that drives value and use AI or technology to increase the speed of it, or to increase the effectiveness of it.
Robert, when you were describing how AI is oftentimes used, what was kind of in my mind is you present to it in the form of prompts. This is what we're doing. And what you might be asking for would result in kind of incremental improvements. Mm-hmm. But you said something that did caught my eye, and that is a lot of people I work with as a coach is that they're very heads down, focused on very specific KPIs.
Yes.
And there's nothing wrong with that. But sometimes when an organization, when they get so myopic, it's only looking at one thing, it might be overlooking others. I looked and was listening to you talk about how you could use AI to think or have it help you think and perhaps operate out of the box.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you said you had examples where it made suggestions that you kind of go, oh, I might not have thought of that. Is that a good use of AI?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the things that happens is that with generative AI, it has seen a lot more than you have. It has digested a lot of documents, a lot of other people's writings and things like that. And so it can give you a different insight. Now, ultimately, you're the one that needs to decide if that insight is valuable or not, and how to take that insight and make it something that is of value to you. But, I think of generative AI sometimes as, that friend that you have that you go and talk to and bounce ideas off of. You don't do everything that friend says. And sometimes that friend is just dead wrong about what they're saying. And so you still have to do the same evaluation of, okay, it's telling me this, but is this really the direction I want to go in? And does this direction make sense, or does this idea make sense? I know for me, and I can just give an example of where I've used it. We create courses, and we actually have a course on AI for leaders, how to drive value for leaders, and a lot of this I'm drawing from that. And I want to talk about that in that process. But there's some times in which we were doing this course. We were doing this course with another friend of ours in another company that we went to Stanley together, and we seen a number of different AI projects, both be successful and fail. And there were times in which we were thinking about, okay, what are the different dimensions that we should talk about this? And we would ask generative AI, saying, hey, we're doing this course. This is the topic. This is what we're saying. Are there other things that we want to think about, or what are some of the things that we want to think about? And it was interesting because it gave us some angles that when we saw them, we're like, oh yeah, that's something that we should talk about. Or yeah, that's an important thing, but it muddies the water, so we're not going to talk about that here. That might be a more advanced thing. But it allowed us to have another place where we could, get help. And it's similar to going to scholarly papers. The really great thing about the internet nowadays is that you can get access to all sorts of information that you weren't able to get access to before. And so I know that sometimes when I'm doing research, especially for doing like a course or doing some other kind of new thing, I'll go and look at scholarly papers and see what they're saying and what they're doing, because they've thought about the thing that I'm trying to accomplish in a different perspective, in a different way. And so generative AI just helps to make that faster sometimes.
You've given some great examples of how you personally and professionally and clients you work with have utilized AI. I want to shift gears with you just for a moment. And that is, ask you to reflect on a time where perhaps you got stuck or the client was stuck. And when that happened, what did it take to get unstuck?
You asked that question before, and there are a few examples that came to mind, but the one example that I want to use now is right now. One of the places that I was stuck, I've been doing entrepreneurial endeavors since I was a little kid. 8 years old, I sold decorated matchboxes and frozen cups. Back in the early times, and then from that have just been doing different entrepreneurial endeavors. And so I thought I really understand entrepreneurship. I have friends that are entrepreneurs. I talk with them. I read books on it. But in the last year, I realized that there was more knowledge that I needed. And so I took a step back and said, let me go to some places that have a more formal training and go through that process. And that process has given me some of the subtler things that I knew about, but it helped to drive things home, and it's helping to drive our company now. And our company is growing and becoming more and more successful because I realized that I didn't know everything that I needed to know. And the reason I tell that story, especially to this audience, is that in listening to some of the podcasts, that the previous podcast, and a little bit understanding the audience, is that there's always something that people are struggling with in small business. And a lot of times it feels like, I've got to kind of do this alone. Well, the people that you work with, they've realized that. And so they're like, let me get somebody else that's a coach, that's an expert in this area, to help me think through it and to help me give guidance. That understanding can make all the difference in the world. And so, I've learned it, and I've learned how to, okay, there's this topic I don't know. Let me go and learn about it, not just from reading articles and stuff like that, but actually, taking classes. That's what we offer, is classes to help people to get out of their own way. And the reason our company is called Team Mindshift is to create that shift of thinking, that perspective that makes you more powerful.
You didn't say this in these words, but as you were given that example, which was a great example, your natural tendency is, if you want to learn something, is to go learn it, because you're a learned individual. But you said in so many words, I don't want to learn it for learning's sake. I want it to open up my eyes and how I can act on what I'm learning. And when you made reference to being an entrepreneur and what you sold, a lot of our listeners kind of fit that description. They're entrepreneurs. They have a good idea. They start a business. The business succeeds. But as it does, it begins to highlight things that they may not have familiarity with. And particularly when they're small, they try to do it all.
Yes.
Yes. And I've seen that both in my consulting role, and I particularly have seen that in my coaching role, because as an organization grows and that person kind of keeps taking on more and more responsibility, there's a sense of isolation almost.
Yeah.
And I think what I'm hearing you describe is that we get sometimes in a frame of mind that there's only one way to do things. And you've kind of opened up my eyes as to how you can use technology, such as AI, to kind of break that. As you reflect on this conversation, what do you want to be the takeaways that our viewers and listeners have?
I want there to be several takeaways. One, think about value and what you can do for your company to drive that value, whether you're an entrepreneur, whether you're a leader in a medium-sized company or a large company, or whatever it is that you're doing. Think about the end game. Don't get caught up in the hype of, oh, you need to use this because it will reduce this or it will give you this gain. But you need to use this because you're trying to drive this value. And if you drive that value in a certain way, that it will give you this gain or this opportunity or this efficiency. That should be the first thing that you think about when you think about making a change or using a technology. The other thing that's a takeaway that I want to give people is that knowledge is power, and knowledge can come from, hiring a business coach, and knowledge can come from taking a course, or knowledge can come from reading articles. Knowledge allows you to expand where you are. Because if you are doing fine where you are and everything is working great, then, keep doing it. But if you think that there is something else that you can be doing, something else out there that you want to reach, then you don't have to do it alone. You've got people around you. You've got opportunities around you that can help support that. And so that's the other thing.
Those are excellent recaps. Before we wrap up, I want to invite our listeners to reflect on a question that affects all leaders. And that is, have you ever wondered why people choose to follow your lead? Is it out of mere obligation, or do they genuinely believe in your vision? It really is true. Leadership thrives on clarity and confidence. It's not just about command. It's about cultivating practical solutions to drive real bottom line results. I invite you to visit bench-builders.com for a personalized leadership strategies that leverage the Fortune 500 insights that I've been able to gain. We're here to elevate your leadership potential and help you make substantial progress towards your goals. So I challenge you to lead in a manner that inspires people to follow because they are drawn to your vision, not merely because they must. So I encourage you to think about how you can lead with clarity and confidence, attracting followers not out of obligation, but inspiration. Dr. Joseph, your insights, as expected, were invaluable. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much. Like I said, Mike, always a pleasure talking with you. When we first met, I was like, oh, this guy, I like talking with him. So this was great. Thank you for having me.
It has been my pleasure, and it's mutual. You're easy to chat with. You've been a great guest. If folks want to engage with you further or have some questions, how can they best reach out to you?
The best way to reach out to me is through LinkedIn. And if you put in Dr. Robert Joseph, all one word, then I'll pop up to the top. Link with me and let me know that you watch or listen to the podcast, and I'll get back in touch with you and we can go from there. And I would love to understand more about what your needs are and how I can help you.
Well, thank you, Robert, and a big thank you to our subscribers for tuning in. I hope today's discussion has provided you with insights to help you get unstuck and on target. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Get Unstuck and On Target. I hope you've gained insights to help you lead with confidence and drive your organization forward. Remember, at Bench Builders, we're committed to your success, your leadership excellence, and your strategic growth. If you've enjoyed our conversation today, please leave a review, rate, and subscribe to keep up with our latest episodes. This show really grows when listeners like you share it with others. Who do you know who needs to hear what we talked about today? Until next time, I encourage you to stay focused on the target and continue to break new ground on your leadership path.